Good morning, afternoon, evening, midnight, whatever it is for you, everyone. Welcome to this final session of the day and conference titled A Layman's Guide to Making Your Donations Better. Most people want their donations to do good, but few realize just how much more impact they could have with a handful of simple habits. This talk introduces donors to an accessible, heart and head approach to giving, how to find causes that are overlooked, avoid common pitfalls, compare options wisely, and understand why some charities create vastly more impact than others. No jargon, no insider assumptions, just clear, practical principles that anyone can use to make their donations go 2, 5, or even 10 times further. If you care about helping others, this talk shows how to do it better. Joey Savoie is the co-founder of Ambitious Impact, a philanthropy organization combining rigorous research, philanthropic advising, and evidence-based charity incubation to scale the most cost-effective solutions in global health and development and animal welfare. Through its grant-making training program, AIM equips philanthropists with the tools and skills they need to set up their giving for maximum impact. His newest project, Elevate Philanthropy, focuses on improving the efficacy of the philanthropy sphere. His priority is simple: to do the most good he can in lives saved and suffering minimized. As a reminder, if you have questions for the speakers, you can submit them via the Swapcard app. I'll be selecting a mix of your questions and some prepared ones during our Q&A. We'll also have office hours immediately following the session and gather around for continued discussion. Please join me in welcoming Joey Savoie to the stage.
Thank you, Keller, and very excited to be here. I'm always thrilled to talk to EAs and love the virtual. It gives it accessibility to this massive audience that I think otherwise would find it tough to travel into London or one of the other conference venues. So really excited to be talking here about giving, my favorite topic and my topic of the future. So to get into the talk, I actually changed the title slightly to make it twice as good because I think we want to be ambitious with our giving. And my claim here is that even if you've thought about philanthropy and giving quite a bit, I think there is a way to become twice as good and double the impact of your giving, which is something I think many of us would strive to do. So, um, generally, strategic giving is known to be a fantastic way to improve the world, but I think it's sometimes underestimated just how significant this is. I mean, when someone saves a life, it makes news headlines, it's a big deal. It often changes the trajectory of their life, both the saver and the person they saved. Think about, someone carrying someone out of a burning building or something like this. And yet, via philanthropy and strategic giving, it's actually possible to save tons of lives. For high net worth givers, it's possible to save a life every day. And for even kind of like standard givers donating something like 1 to 10% of their income, it's possible to save a life every single year, which is pretty fantastic when you think about it. Now, of course, with this great power comes a lot of responsibility and a lot of obligation. We want to kind of do the most that we can with this huge amount of ability we have to affect change in the world. And I think that there's some pretty straightforward principles that can make a huge difference when it comes to how many lives you save and how big an impact your donations and philanthropic decisions ultimately make. It can make them a lot more transformative. In general, I think you have to both apply the heart, the compassion, the caring about something, and the head, kind of the rational, reasoning, numbers-based approach to end up having the maximum impact you can, which is what we're all striving for. A story that often comes to mind when I'm talking about this approach is a party that I was once at where I kind of got sat between two very different perspectives on philanthropic giving. On the one side, I had what I would call a tree hugger, someone who's, a hippie. They weren't wearing shoes. They were wearing nice, long, flowy clothes. They're very excited about following your heart, making a difference, and were extremely passionate. On my other side was someone who was extremely quantitative and numbers driven. You can think Gordon Gekko or some of the hilarious stock traders you see in movies as a decent archetype for this person. And they were very, very data orientated, but didn't have a lot of compassion for others. They weren't really looking at the downtrodden. And I think the best philanthropists I've met really combine both of these perspectives really beautifully. They kind of have the motivation of a lot of charitable givers who have come before and a lot of people who work in the philanthropic sector and really put their heart and dedication into something. They're kind of driven by that compassion. But in terms of decision making, they're almost using the quantitative rigor and analysis of a hedge fund or a stockbroker. They're really kind of following the data, even if it might not be the most obvious thing or the thing that first saliently comes to mind. And I think that's how you end up maximizing your impact. So there's a lot of different ways of kind of finding ways to make more good. And one of the first one that comes to mind, and probably the one that the EA movement talks about the most, is scope. what area do you ultimately focus on? There's a million and a hundred problems that we can work on, and not all of them are kind of equal in terms of how much progress we can make, how much of a difference we can make. So my kind of heuristic for scope here is we want to pick something that's both neglected and narrow. If you're a big foundation, choosing a scope where you represent 2 to 20% of the field can allow kind of the right level of specialization versus actually picking something that's kind of neglected and not being talked about. And a more layman's approach to this is if you hear about it on the news or hear your friends talking about it as an area, it's probably not the most neglected area for you to work on. But I'll get back with a few heuristics as to how you might decide that. There's three kind of fundamental ways you can narrow your scope down from looking at every problem in the world down to kind of a more practical, reasonable number of problems that you can solve. One is cause area, one is geographic focus, and one is NGO size. Now, cause area we already touched on, but I think a decent rule of thumb for thinking about cause area is thinking about the moral circle. The basic idea of a moral circle is that over thousands of years, humanity's empathy has expanded to more and more beings. Once upon a time, people had a pretty limited group that they were kind of taking care of. Maybe you take care of your family and nothing really outside of that. That would kind of expand to your tribe, your village, nations. And now we have many people who are globally altruistic. They're thinking about kind of all beings all across the globe. And I think the interesting area when thinking about cause areas and scope is what's at the edge of your moral circle? What's a group that you might include, but most people wouldn't? So, say your siblings. Most people do include their siblings in the moral circle. That's kind of a very common thing, or even their city. Many people would have that in the moral circle. Now, if you go global and you say, well, I care about someone on the other side of the globe, that's a bit more rare. That's a bit more on the edge of other people's moral circles. Maybe it's comfortably inside of yours. You can think about this in terms of species as well. So maybe most people care about dogs and cats. That's a pretty straightforward, pretty in the center of the moral circle. But do most people care about shrimp or bugs or very small animals? That's a lot more rare. So that would be at the edge of your moral circle. Now, everyone's moral circle is a bit different, and over time, people's circles have been expanding. But a decent kind of heuristic, a rule of thumb, is to think about what's the very edge of your moral circle? What's the thing that you kind of care about that very few other people care about? And that could be a really promising area for a cause area to focus on. Now, let's talk about geography. This is a big factor when you think about scope in terms of where in the world you work. And there's a lot of different aspects of geography. There's both your city to your country to around the globe, and in general, how far away someone is from you. Typically, people help people close by to them, but there's real problems with that. At the end of the day, if charity begins at home, the richest neighborhoods benefit the most. Often the best location is actually pretty far away from where you've thought about or where it's become salient. It could be that the most important place to work on in the whole world is within 100 blocks of where you're born, but it's pretty unlikely. For most people, the best place to work on, where you'll make the most difference, could be very far away. In fact, going off that kind of moral circle side, it might be a place you've never thought of or heard of before. A better way to look at it is kind of looking at other factors that might make a location more promising. What's the total need? Is there a lot of people who are suffering a lot? What's the tractability? Is it possible to make progress on an issue in that way? Where I was born, Vancouver, one of the big issues is homelessness, which is an incredibly important issue, very, very salient. And I could see it everywhere when I was walking to school and this sort of thing. It was also a very, very difficult problem to solve. Often there was layered issues to do with society and drug use and disability and a bunch of layered problems. On the flip side, when I learned about global health, it was a $3 bed net that it could cost to save someone's life. It was a much simpler solution and a much more tractable one. So it ended up, even though no one I know has had malaria, that ended up being a more simple, tractable solution to saving a life than trying to pull someone out of homelessness in Vancouver, where I was from. The next one is one that people think about a little bit less, but it's a size specialization. So when you think about the finance world and investors, often investors kind of have a class of organizations that they focus on. Maybe they're a Series A investor and they go for projects that are a little bit further along. Maybe they're a seed stage investor and they start right at the beginning doing an angel investment or venture capital investment. The same thing happens with the charity world. It's actually pretty different to evaluate an Oxfam-sized organization than it is to evaluate an organization that came out yesterday. And when thinking about your effectiveness and your grant making, you can think significantly about kind of the size and stage and maturity of the organizations that you're supporting. Big NGOs tend to be more resilient, more stable. You might know what you're getting. They might have years of track record. Think something like a Give Well recommended charity. This is a fantastic bet. It's been around for a long time. There's a very high predictability in what's impactful. On the other hand, with seed stage NGOs, you'll get some benefits. Often they're cheaper, they're smaller, your donation might be more catalytic, but they're higher risk. Even the AIM graduation program, which is extremely competitive to get into, only about a third of charities do fantastically out of it, and another third are gone within 2 years. So it's a higher risk proposition, just like it is in for-profit investing. Now, if you're a low time philanthropist, you don't have a ton of time to go into it. I think the best strategy here is just to defer to like a charity evaluator, someone like GiveWell or Animal Charity Evaluators, or someone like this who kind of does the research for you and finds some good organizations that are big. But if you're highly active in your grant making, you're spending full-time amounts of capacity, or you're thinking about setting up a new charitable foundation or new organization, it's really worth looking at the ecosystem and thinking where are the gaps. Is it that there are big orgs that get covered all the time and small orgs that get missed? Or is everyone really excited about innovation, funds a lot of small orgs, and it's actually the big stable orgs that people forget? It's worth kind of looking at your cause area and where the specific gaps in that might be. So I think NGO size is another very interesting way to scope. Now, regardless of the area that you decide to focus on, what your ultimate scope is, there's some kind of principles that I'm going to call powers because all their first letters add up to being the word powers, and it was kind of nice and catchy. Six powers principles that I think you can use to increase your impact within that scope. Because within every area, even if it's a good area in the broad sense, there's good and bad charitable organizations, and there's better and worse donations within them. So we'll go through each of these powers fairly briefly, but I think they can be applied to virtually any cause area or consideration. First one is price tag, and this one's probably the most important one. I sometimes relate this to toasters because when you buy a toaster, you actually get a surprising amount of information. You know, you go on Amazon, you get reviews, you get the cost, you get what other people have said on it, you get to compare it side by side with many other toasters. You can see the feature list a lot of the time. You actually get quite a lot of information about what exactly you're buying when you press that buy button, even if it's a $30 toaster. On the other hand, there are millions of dollars of grants that don't have that level of transparency or don't have that much information. There might not even be a clear sense of how much you're buying of a given thing. But this kind of knowing the price tag, knowing what you're buying, is actually really, really important to actually finding the effectiveness of the charitable organization. Maybe there's two charities that deliver bed nets. If one of them delivers bed nets for $50 a bed net, and the other one delivers bed nets for $5 a bed net, assuming they're kind of the same quality bed nets and delivered in roughly the same way, you're getting a huge value by buying the $5 bed nets. And yet in the charity world, there's actually a lot of inefficient bed nets. There's a lot of $500 toasters that don't really do toast any better that are kind of out there. So this is sometimes called cost effectiveness. How much are you getting for the dollar that you're buying? Another way to frame it is just knowing the price tag of what you're actually investing in philanthropically. This is one of the biggest things that separates out the top charities and not. So pulling out ideally an end line number like how many lives are saved or how much income is generated, or at least a proxy number, how many bed nets are delivered or how many people are affected, is super important for actually identifying a particularly good charity. Again, this is independent of the area. If you're working in animals, you want to know how many animals are saved. If you're working in climate, you want to know how many CO2 tons are pulled out of the atmosphere, that sort of thing. And the price tag can vary a lot depending on different cause areas. So here's a kind of research piece that I tried to do to pull out what you could get for $1 million donation in different cause areas. And you'll notice they're pretty different. And there's ethical judgments that come into this. I mean, maybe it's not clear whether you'd prefer $100 million of economic growth or whether you'd prefer to save 200 lives. You know, some of these are very tough, deep-seated ethical philosophical questions. But some look a little more obvious. For example, global health, you can save about 200 lives for $1 million. And in high income health, you can only save about 40. Now, saving 40 lives is still fantastic, and I wouldn't want to discourage anyone from saving 40 lives, but compared to 200, doesn't feel like as good a deal. And when you make a donation of any sort, whether it's $1 million donation or a $10 donation, you're implicitly making a trade-off between all the other areas that you could have donated to. You could donate to the arts and support something there. You could donate to health and support something there. Everything has kind of different pros and cons, and it's really good to actually put these into numbers so you can see the size of these trade-offs. And I would say often when people quantify this out, they're surprised at how effective some areas are relative to others. Turns out global health is just fantastically cheap to affect things. Economic growth or income in the third world is fantastically effective of kind of improving things. Other things can be really different. Farmed animal welfare, for example, you can help 3 million animals for the same price as many of the other interventions where you're helping hundreds. Now, maybe animals aren't the top cause, but is 3 million worth it compared to 40? You really have to think about these sort of things. So I think it's often worth knowing exactly what you're buying for the philanthropic investment or donation that you're making. Next up, options. Now, with options, I like to give the analogy of a menu. Um, it's hard to pick a really great option from a restaurant if when they give you a menu, you only get two things that pop up. um, you can imagine that it would limit your ability to find something that's really tasty, a really good fit. Again, in the philanthropy and charity sector, often this doesn't happen. Often people aren't considering that many options. Now, I think there's one exception where it's kind of okay to not consider that many options, which is if someone's already narrowed down the menu for you. Yeah, if someone like GiveWell or Animal Charity Evaluators has looked through hundreds of charities and narrowed down the list down to three, and then you're picking amongst those three, fair enough. That's like a professional chef going through all of your dietary preferences and finding the three best things that you might like. Yeah, that's good. But when you're kind of bumping into options mostly organically, say things that you hear about from friends or bump into in the news or hear about from organic networks like a conference, that's really quite random and haphazard. It's not really developing a strong candidate of options. Most funders, especially philanthropic big funders who are doing this full time, they suffer from too few options. They're not really comparing as much of the field as you would like, and especially comparing it in kind of a systemized, careful way. Mm. One of the ways I suggest kind of comparing different grants when you're thinking about it is making something called a weighted factor model. This is kind of like a table, putting in the criteria that you care about at the top and the options that you're considering on the side. And then you kind of weigh out a little bit numerically what might be the best grant to give. And maybe you care about different things. These are just some stand-in criteria. They're not the end-all be-all of weighting between models. But starting to put something in a quantitative model like this and starting to compare a bunch of options instead of just a couple tends to end you up with better charitable options. You can see in this case, Grant A looks really good, a lot better than Grant B and C. And it wouldn't have been quite as obvious if you just looked at it from afar, or especially if you'd hit on this different times. Maybe someone bumps into Grant C first and they make a donation, and they realize Grant A is actually a better choice down the line. So getting a bit more systematized in if you're going to make a donation, especially a large scale grant, say over $10,000, you really want to consider a couple different options. And the bigger the grant size, the more options you want to consider. Again, unless you're using a charity evaluator, because then they consider the options for you. Someone should have considered at least 100 options, though, before narrowing down to a really fantastic charity that's going to get tens of millions of dollars. Next up, who should evaluate your grants? I think this is a really fascinating one because it's one that people almost never think about. But when you're making a decision about donating or making a philanthropic donation, you have to think about who's actually the person who'd be best aligned, best able to make a great decision on this. And it actually varies quite a bit depending on your exact circumstance. For example, I've talked about charity evaluators a couple of times. They put in a fantastically huge amount of hours to evaluate things. GiveWell's put over 60,000 hours into their evaluation process. Years and years of time. That's more time than any individual will be able to put in. That can be a really promising thing, particularly if you have shared assumptions with GiveWell. Do you like high certainty interventions? Do you like evidence-based giving? GiveWell's interventions are going to be really good for you. But even as you get bigger, a lot of people tend to think, oh, I need to start a foundation. That's like the next big step. I'm going to give $1 million a year or something like that. I need to set up a dedicated team, hire a bunch of staff, build it all out. And sometimes that makes sense, but sometimes it makes sense to work with a philanthropic advisor, one person who kind of works as a personalized team and can work with a bunch of different clients, maximizing the things, or work in a network of funders. So I've run these funding circles where between 5 and 10 funders kind of get together and co-grant together. Everyone makes their own decisions, but you're sharing the due diligence process and the kind of analytical steps that all the different grantees go through. So thinking a little bit more about whether you're actually the right person in the right position to evaluate your grants, or whether you should do it as a team or bring someone else in who's particularly informed about the topic area you're excited about, can be a really good way to transform the impact of your grant making. Next step is evaluate. So I think a really cool thing to do here that very few do is setting a concrete benchmark. Now, we have benchmarks for all sorts of things. They're kind of like a bar to beat, a standard that we want to do. I sometimes talk about a craftsman keeping one of their finest chairs that they've made next to their desk so they kind of know what they should strive for, what their opinion a good quality thing looks for. A lot of grant makers actually do the same. They kind of have a charity that's like their bar to beat. It's something they want to do really well consistently. And there's a few kind of standards for a benchmark charity that make it particularly good. Ideally, you want a charity that can absorb lots of funding. For instance, you could donate all the money that you want to it and it would be fine. Ideally, you want something that kind of delivers consistently. It's predictable. It's not like a one-off opportunity that's only going to be around for a short period of time. And ideally, you want something that you could put in that framework. So going back to that grant evaluation framework, you want something that kind of fit into that and you can kind of see how it compares to the things. I think a really good benchmark here is something like the Against Malaria Foundation or some other GiveWell top charity. These are pretty strong charities. And at the end of the day, when I'm making a donation, I need to think, is it better than this top GiveWell charity? And sometimes I think it is, and it kind of compares well, and the numbers do well, and I donate to that charity instead. But often it's not. And it doesn't have to be just that way for global health. I've seen animal grant makers have a benchmark. I've seen climate donors have a benchmark. Often it's a large charity that is particularly well known in the sector. It could be some charity that moves tens of millions of dollars every year and is kind of generally seen as competent. Doctors Without Borders, I've seen as a benchmark. One Acre Fund, I've seen as a benchmark. These are kind of big orgs that are doing pretty solid work that you wouldn't feel that sad to give a bunch of money to. So setting a benchmark kind of gives a threshold, a criteria in which you want all your other charities to kind of pass and move above and beyond. One of the benchmarks that I mentioned that I use is GiveWell, or 10 times better than cash. GiveWell's recently changed this a little bit, so this will age a little bit in terms of now cash is more valuable than they previously thought. But for a long time, 10x cash was kind of this way of describing what a really great program would look like. And this makes a lot of sense. In fact, cash as a benchmark in general makes a lot of sense. And there's been some pushes for governments to do this. If you're giving development aid and assistance, at a bare minimum, you want it to be better than just if you had handed the same amount of cash to the beneficiaries in the country. And surprisingly, a lot of charitable programs don't beat cash. Cash is actually pretty good. It's a hard benchmark to beat. GiveWell's benchmark is, of course, even higher. So those are both good standards. Now, a big flaw that I see a lot of grant makers do, in fact, probably the most common one I see that shoots grant makers in the foot, especially kind of mid or small stage grant makers, is they're trying to give money and not a lot of extra work for the charitable organizations. So a lot of the time when NGOs are asked to spend a bunch of time on applications and processes, it's kind of taking away from their mission. Now, of course, you need enough information to actually evaluate whether the charity is good, but that doesn't necessarily mean you have to ask the charity 110 questions or put things into different formats. If you have a 1 hour call with a charity, it could be the case that they prepped for a couple hours for that call. It could be the case that they make a couple more hours of documentation to send you after the call. You really want to make sure that you're utilizing their time respectfully and wisely as your donor, especially if you're a bigger grant donor who you think the charity might be catering a lot of things around. One of the best ways to kind of reduce the amount of time that you're asking for a charity is research on the intervention level. So, for instance, instead of looking at a specific charity, maybe I'll look at the entire area of malaria or the entire area of bednet malaria before I kind of dive into who's the best bednet charity. This is what a lot of charity evaluators and research think tanks do, is they're kind of look at a slightly broader level and then they can do research without taking up the charity's time. And another thing is taking the formats that the charities have things in. So a lot of grant applications will ask a charity to format their budget in a really specific way. That's great for the person receiving the grant, who's kind of reviewing them all side by side. It's a real pain in the butt for all the charities, though, to have to reformat all of their budgets into specific readable formats. So I think I just encourage a lot of grant makers to try to be considerate. Think about how much time you're taking from the charity side and really make sure that that's adding value, or at least is taking away limited amounts of hours relative to what you might be able to research on your own or with a philanthropic advisor. Two funders I know quite well, that I use as stories sometimes is I know this funder named John, is not a true name, but he has a process for a 100K grant that's just monstrous. It takes about 40 hours for a charity to go through it. There's a lot of different format requests. There's endless questions and calls. He's really, really pedantic on details. He wants things formatted in a very particular way to kind of appeal to this donor. And the outcome is nonprofits actually warn each other away from this funder. They're like, oh, don't start that process because it's super long and painful and it takes a really long time to actually see any impact from it. On the other hand, I know another funder, Sarah, who's particularly good. She's really, really efficient. She doesn't take that much of the NGO's time at all. She does a lot of research. In fact, I would say her decisions are a bit more thorough than John's, but it's not by pushing the burden onto the NGOs. It's by kind of investigating it herself and coming to a reasonable conclusion of where the broad area is. When she comes into a call with the NGOs, she's really prepped and has a structured amount of questions, and it only ever lasts an hour. She also talks a lot to other funders, which is a really good way of saving time. You don't have to reinvent the wheel every time you give a grant or every time you give a donation. A lot of the time, the research is already out there. Someone's already thought about it. Someone's already talked about it. And so you can even ask the charity what other funders have investigated them and did they have any other reviews? And it can save you a lot of time. Unsurprisingly, NGOs love working with this funder. They are whenever she opens an application, she gets a bunch of really fantastic kind of people applying who wouldn't apply to a more long-winded process. The last one's really broad, and I call it substance over style. And basically, style is what looks good. And unfortunately, style is what leads a lot of NGOs to success. It's stuff like polish or celebrity endorsements or having a really sharp website or being good at public speaking. All these things that are kind of good to make something look good, but fundamentally don't change whether the NGO is particularly cost effective, whether the NGO is particularly good at its job, whether it's particularly successful. A lot of it's about communication skills. And although communication skills are great, they're not really the substance of why we want to fund an NGO. We don't want to fund an NGO because it had the prettiest website. But a lot of NGOs do get funding because they have a really pretty website, because they look very professional or look very put together. What we instead want to do is we want to fund what works, you know, evidence bases, theories of change, good price tags, honest data-driven approaches, these sort of things that actually lead to more analytical rigor. The kind of trick I have for this is, what if I took away the person giving the presentation and I just read the transcript, or I just looked at the slides in black and white or something like this? Would what they're saying still make sense? Would what they're saying still be persuasive? Or is it more persuasive because they have a really particularly engaging presentation style? And am I finding them very persuasive because they told an emotive story? Or is it because the data didn't lie? You got to kind of look at what are the aspects that hold weight and don't fade over time. It's easy enough for a presentation to be really good. It doesn't mean that the NGO is particularly good. The last thing I want to touch on is community. Because even if you're an efficient giver and you do a lot of things philanthropically and you cause a lot of impact and you're very involved in the space, there's actually a lot more ways that you can improve the impact of your donations by kind of bringing others along for the journey. So there's two broad networks that you can interact with as a donor. One is your kind of personal network, the people you already know or already knew before. And then there's kind of external communities, specialized philanthropic groups that kind of provide peer learning or provide benefits from that. I want to touch on both of them. So in general, for your network, you really want to think about people close by who might share similar visions. So sometimes for a philanthropy family, this is thinking about whether your siblings are interested or whether your parents are interested. Sometimes for someone who's an individual giver, it's thinking about work colleagues or who might be fascinated in this. But generally thinking about who would be particularly good kind of allies to work with, and then try to kind of transparently bring information to them and share and bring people along that map. Remember, you might have, 10x amount of impact relative to donating to a normal charity, but if you can share that information, you might be able to amplify that even further. For example, if someone had an initial donation of, say, £10,000 in this particular case, but she shared it with her broader network, her colleagues, classmates, and investments, it's quite possible that the network donations would far exceed her own. There's also a lot of corporate giving programs, so it's always worth keeping an eye out for whether your organization that you work for or an organization you could work for, if you're considering multiple jobs, has a donation match. And it can give you a huge return on investment by kind of modifying this out. One thing that used to be very popular in the A movement was people donating their birthdays and Christmases and these sort of things, kind of sharing with their network that philanthropic donations were a thing that was particularly exciting to them relative to paper gifts. And a lot of people got a lot more donations than they would have gotten in physical gifts, because that's a kind of cause area that people are excited about. And yeah, it's supporting the individual, and they're probably not using all the principles that I talked about in the earlier slides, but getting someone's foot in the door to philanthropic giving can be really valuable, especially if it's stuff that's already built in. The other thing that I recommend everyone to do is kind of find a philanthropic community. It's really easy to get in your own bubble and think about how to have an impact kind of with your own individual dollars. But again, your broader network might be more powerful than you are, often will be more powerful than you. And the broader world is huge. And a lot of people have already learned these lessons. So if you're making a pledge, for example, taking the Giving What We Can pledge, the 10% pledge, or the Founders Pledge, it's really useful to tap into those communities and social networks and events and kind of build off that. If you have a particular cause area that you know you're donating to and you're donating substantially, there's often cause area communities like Centera for farmed animals or Big Bang for global health that you can tap into if you're becoming a philanthropist who's getting more and more involved in the area. And there's learning focused things. So stuff like Forward Global or the AIM grant making program that I helped start can help kind of bring you along that philanthropic journey to make more donations more effectively and become an even better philanthropist. And I think these communities serve a lot of different purposes. On the one hand, they serve socially to make you feel satisfied and connected and you're able to talk to other people about kind of relatable experiences that maybe aren't as common to talk about outside of other people donating significant amounts. But they're also incredibly motivating. So from a psychology perspective, I've noticed that people that engage with philanthropy communities and donor communities tend to stay philanthropic and donation oriented a heck of a lot longer than those that kind of do it in isolation, far away and removed from everybody else. So I have a decent heuristic, which is try to spend at least 5% of your time with other people who are giving in a significant way, the same way you are, to kind of maximize your connection to that and ultimately be more values connected in the long term. In general, you're a sum of your five closest peers. So if you pick five peers who are going to particularly support you doing more impact in the world, and honestly, this goes outside donation to even thinking about career paths or having an impact via volunteering or this sort of thing. If you have people that are kind of motivated and excited and want to go along that path with you, you're going to travel a lot further. And it also ends up multiplying out your impact too, because you'll probably inspire them and that sort of thing. So yeah, some of your five closest peers, pick them very well. If you pick them with a bit more of an ethical thought, who you want to aspire towards, who you want to kind of connect with and become more like, you'll end up having more of an impact in the long term as well. So to distill it all down into a couple sharp steps, I think picking a scope is really important, particularly a scope that's narrow enough that you can kind of wrap your head around. Choosing a neglected cause area that's kind of right at the end of your expanded moral circle is a pretty good way to do it. Know the price tag of your options or how much good you get done per dollar and compare that to a few other options can be a really good way to increase kind of the magnitude of impact you're having, regardless of the cause area. And build your community, spending a little bit of dedicated time to connect with other funders or other people who share your impact-driven attitudes can make you a lot more impactful and a lot more likely to stay impact oriented in the long term. And that's it.
Thank you very much, Joey. Really appreciate it. So, right now we have one question from the community, so I'm going to ask people to come up with more, but I will start up with this and then ask more of my own until someone else steps up. So, first question from the audience, and I think it is a good one. How would you compare the effectiveness of short-term versus long-term focused orgs? It can be difficult to do a cost-benefit of an analysis of a program that is saying, okay, we are trying to do long-term cultural or political change versus one that's saying, yeah, this year we have accomplished this many shrimp stunned instead of killed painfully. How do you deal with that sort of uncertainty?
Yeah, well, I guess I'll give the safe and the slightly less safe answer to this. The safe answer is, depends on context. There's probably some charities that are really great, that are really impossible to measure and should be donated to and should be taken seriously. And you can probably find some convergent evidence for those charities. Like we talked to 10 experts, they were all excited about it. And we looked at some proxies and they looked kind of promising. And we looked at a reference class that was kind of similar levels of charities and they had some promising results as well. But I think the slightly harsher answer is you got to be really careful not to trick yourself. Because as soon as you take away the numbers, as soon as you take away the rigor, it does become a bit more subjective. It does become a bit more wishy-washy. So although there is no doubt fantastic charities that are super difficult to measure, I would say the bulk of the best charities are measured. And a lot of the kind of charities that aren't measured are people making a case for something that if there was evidence on might not look as good as you would hope it to be. It's really tough to do good in the world. We've tried hundreds of different things, and when we do in-depth RCT studies, many of them don't work. So I guess the slightly more brutal answer is like really try to falsify it. Really make sure you're not tricking yourself. Really investigate that claim and determine, okay, is this actually one of those outlier charities that is great and is just particularly hard to measure, or is it what most charities are, which is they say that it is hard to measure, but maybe that's because they're having trouble having as much impact.
Okay, I confess I'm not quite seeing how this lines up with your own talk. Because I saw a table from your talk saying, and I apologize I don't have the ability to quote it, something to the effect of you can do this much economic growth through policy research. Policy research is a very, very difficult area to measure or know that you're having any impact. I'm getting my PhD in the topic, and I don't know if I'm having any impact. How are you going to tell me on one hand that, like, I should really focus on these places with observable, and then on the other say, oh yeah, for economic development, don't do the things that have RCTs, do the RCTs?
Yeah, I guess I would say that there are cause areas that categorically seem tougher to evaluate. Policy, I think, is an example here, but I do think that maybe I'd say like 9 out of 10 donations where there's no evidence. I think people are fooling themselves instead of coming to, oh, this looks like a particularly good side. For policy, I think the question you ask yourself is like, what commensurate upside am I trading off to deal with this lower evidence base? So if we take global health policy versus global health direct delivery, which is like close as you can get to comparisons. Typically, you're trading off really high levels of possible cost effectiveness, like really, really efficient. Oh my God, you can just cover a whole country in this intervention for kind of crappy evidence bases, stuff that you can't verify quite as much. And maybe then it ends up kind of equally weighting on your spreadsheet, or maybe you end up going for the thing that is higher risk. But I do think it's fair to penalize risk. I think it's fair to kind of like knock down a peg and require something that looks commensurately better in proportion to really get excited about that. I am pretty excited about economic growth as an intervention area, but it is because of this kind of like extremely high upside. And I think there's some other evidence bases that you can use. So, yeah, you can't look at like a specific policy on a country level and see it being randomized. That's really tough. But I think you can look at, okay, what have been the driving forces of X number of people getting out of poverty? Okay, how much of it is attributable to health stuff? How much of it is attributed to economic growth stuff? How do we kind of replicate that? It's still tough, though. I mean, God, yeah, if you ask me for like 10 fantastic charities in economic growth, I don't think I'd have 10 for you.
I'm a fan of the Center for Global Development. We've had one of the speakers here today at this conference, and I think but they are clearly in that sort of vaguer category where I think even if you talk to them, they would say, okay, we've got a few points where we had like relatively measurable wins where we really fought for something, we identified the issue, we were able to push for it, and you can sort of do that retrospectively and say, hey, we were able to find this. But you touched on something that I do want to ask more about. You say you want to have this trade-off between uncertainty and expected value. How much uncertainty is required for how much expected value for you personally? Like, if I
Yeah.
double the impact that I'm anticipating, how much uncertainty has to outweigh that?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I would describe myself as risk neutral, which is a factor people often get confused with uncertainty. Risk is like if the probabilities are known. So if you're rolling a dice, you don't know which side of the dice will come up, but you know that, one of those numbers will. You have a 1 in 6 chance of getting a three, for example. Uncertainty is much messier because that typically is like rolling a dice where you have no idea how many sides there are. And I don't penalize risk all that much, almost zero. But I do penalize uncertainty pretty hard. And it's coming down a little bit to my sense of values of the world. So I tend to find that when things are more uncertain and then get certainty because they're clarified through whatever studies or research or deeper analysis or something like this, normally things regress. They become closer to zero, less significant than we kind of thought. Now, again, some of these interventions look so good that even after a pretty heavy regression, they end up still looking good. They end up still looking worth doing and this sort of thing. But with uncertainty based stuff, I would say I have a decent appetite for it if it's falsifiable in the next 5 years and it is a cheap-ish test. So this is part of why ambitious impact, of course, takes risks and uncertain risks about charitable interventions. But we're typically taking bets in areas where you would have a sense after 5 years. And even with something like health policy, I mean, you might not know exactly to the dollar how much good has been done, but you'll probably know whether some of those policies are moving forward, whether they've got bills on the floor, whether stuff like that has moved in the kind of 5 year timeline. Where if there's something that is really uncertain. So maybe I'll pick on AI as a favorite EA topic. That one's really tough, even after 5 years, to know whether you're making tractionable progress on that. So we're a bit harsher on those sort of things that don't eventually have that kind of falsifiability testing loop swing back.
That makes sense. And 5 years is a reasonable time to have that expectation. And for many policy areas, if someone has nothing to show after 5 years, it seems pretty reasonable to be fairly skeptical of them. I do have an audience question now, so I'll take that mostly because I think it's a good audience question. So some of the tools you mentioned and seem pretty hard for many game makers to do without becoming an expert. Are you sort of recommending that, like, it's if you are donating $3 million, it is worth investing a fair chunk of your own time? Are you focusing on sort of outsourcing that to others or working with a community or a small circle of people? Like, what do you do to resolve that issue?
Yeah, I think there's kind of like a spectrum of how much time you want to put in and how much capital you're deploying. And as you move up the time capital continuum, different actions make sense. So if you're low time and low capital, I think a charity evaluator is just like a really good bet. They're straightforward, they're easy options to deploy, that sort of thing. If you're super high time, super high capital, then I think you are looking at setting up a full charitable foundation. So if you're doing 50 million a year, probably it's time to hire some full-time staff, including you, to deploy that sort of thing. Where the exact cutoffs are, where you end up going to philanthropic advisor and funding circle and this sort of thing is a bit more debatable. But I think once you're donating six figures, so say 100,000 plus, I think it's worth thinking about putting some serious time into that, even if it's not your hours. So if you're too busy, I'd be thinking philanthropic advisor. I'd be thinking other funds that you might be able to defer to who do some further research on the sort of area that you're excited about. If you are, retired and putting in a bunch of time to it, maybe at yeah, I would say a million plus probably worth is full time, and then 5 million plus you're probably looking at multiple staff and that sort of thing. Yeah, but it does depend. I do think sometimes the right call for people is picking some person they trust, whether it's a person or an org or something like that, and just focusing on earning themselves, just like maximizing their earnings. You see this a lot of the time with entrepreneurs where it's like they could exit their business and do philanthropy full time because they're donating 10 million a year, but maybe it makes sense for them to try to get up to 100 million a year and just give it to some ED or philanthropic advisor or something like that. But yeah, I guess the short answer is the more your money goes up, I do think more time collectively should be put into that money. Whether that's from you versus an advisor versus an org, that's a bit more debatable depending on your cause area and who you can defer to. Like, if you love global health, man, GiveWell is sure an easy choice. If you're really into somewhere that doesn't have a charity evaluator, that's a lot tougher, right? Like, then you have to kind of forge your own path.
That makes sense. I do sometimes wonder what would the give well of arts education look like, and how would I try to optimize that if I was running that approach. Now, so first of all, you mentioned the term ED, and I didn't recognize that one. Would you mind defining it?
Executive director.
Okay,
Yeah,
yeah,
just like a
makes
CEO.
sense. Sounds good. And then the other one. So obviously, when you're outsourcing, you start running into risks of other people having different priorities and values from you, right? And I think a really shockingly small number of people who I know who go give money through GiveWell have actually looked at their publicly available spreadsheet on moral weights, which has different weights for like how bad do we think a miscarriage is, how much do we value the life of an infant, how much do we value the life of an adult, and like those are three different numbers that different people have different opinions about. And I think I've really been surprised when people are like, oh, huh, I do actually have opinions about those. I don't know if mine line up with the median person who reviewed that spreadsheet at GiveWell. And so that's always a worry to me of how do you know that you are, like, actually going to be aligned on values with the people that you're outsourcing to. And I'm curious how you think about resolving that conflict and resolving that issue.
Yeah, I think this is a bit of a failure mode. I honestly think the philanthropic space could be and should be quite a lot better at this, where it'd be nice if there was something like a 10 question quiz, and then that spit out, hey, here's an area you might be interested in investigating in based on your ethics and morals. And ideally that those questions are designed by someone who's not trying to guide you to like one specific charity that the end line is. I think that would actually be super useful because there are these fundamental assumptions. And I think some we have enough data that we can start to talk about like, okay, categorically this looks pretty good, categorically this looks pretty bad, but some are tough. When I talk to people a lot about is health versus wealth. So ultimately, how many kind of lives saved would you trade off for how many income doublings? And Gibble has a number. It's based on a survey. It seems like a pretty good guess. But if you value that number twice as much one way or twice as much the other way, you end up doing radically different things. And at the end of the day, I actually personally, I wouldn't be able to justify that number that hard. And I have met people who focus on livelihoods and income charities that I think make a really good case that, hey, I just value the GiveWell trade-off a little bit differently. And that ends up at smallholder farmers and microcredit and all these different interventions that EAs basically never talk about. And I think that there really is a case for ethics are messy and hard and quite subjective, and there probably is ethical variance. I guess the other possibility is depends on how much time you have. So if your choice is donate to GiveWell or spend an hour getting into the ethics, realizing that it's all kind of complicated and giving up, well, I prefer you to donate to GiveWell. If you're going to set up another foundation and you could donate $5 million and you could hire three staff who think really well about a different cause area in a slightly unique way, wow, I mean, that's very exciting. I think that provides a lot of value for the philanthropic world, even outside of the direct donations you're doing.
Absolutely, absolutely, yeah, and like I really appreciate there's a couple of small orgs that are really focused on suffering and are like, no, we think that this is morally important. We disagree with others on how morally important, and so we are like just going all in on that area. But sort of following up on that, I think a place where I'll ponder on that and ask a different question from the audience. Retrospective funding as a strategy, yay or nay?
Retrospective funding. Interesting. So I would are they getting at like cash fund results, like kind of philanthropic funding, or
I'm assuming so. Like, I admit I'm really excited by the various ideas of, like, okay, we will sell impact bonds and other things in that area. And I'm always a little wary because I'm like, these sound very cute. They've appealed to me personally and my style of things. How do I know that, like, this is not just the things that I think are cool sounding and that they will have an impact? There's that uncertainty there, and how do you know when to disagree with the much broader expert community, how they've traditionally been doing things?
Yeah, well, so I have two thoughts here. One is I don't think it's actually as different as people sometimes think. So, yes, most grants given are for like a promise of future work and some sort of execution, but they are premised on what that organization has delivered in the past, and they're almost always scaling based on amount, based on historical track record. So, a lot of like classical foundations, they'll give quite a small grant, their first grant, and then the execution on that grant basically justifies the next grant, which justifies the next grant. So it's not quite literally pay on results in that they're not like, hey, you give us 55 bed nets covered, we'll give you this amount of money. But it kind of is because they're estimating it pretty accurately based on the last tranche of funding that they gave in a very similar way. On the more kind of like impact markety type sides, like, oh, should we set up some impact market for buying things? I think the thing just is like you need a group of people that are really excited by that to kind of make that work, and it needs to hit a critical mass. So it's a bit like, oh, we could start a better social network than Facebook. Like, sure, but you have to get a lot of people on Facebook to make that work. I think if a huge philanthropist came in and said, hey, I'm really excited about pay for results, impact stuff, or I'm really excited about prediction markets that have good incentives, or these sort of things. I think they can make it work, but I think it probably would require like a significant, particularly interested philanthropist to come in on that. I think changing the whole market dynamic is really tough. I mean, geez, if we could change the whole market just from don't look at pretty websites, look at numbers, like any number, that would already be a massive improvement for the philanthropic world. So, all the way to like, okay, these are like sub predictions of impact bonds. That's the niche of the niche.
No, that makes sense. That makes sense. Yeah, I wouldn't want to get ahead of ourselves too far, too fast. Grabbing another audience question here. I'm curious what you see, either including your powers framework or going beyond it, the key inefficiencies in philanthropic spaces, and if there are sort of projects that could actually solve them. Because, like, yeah, pretty websites bias is an issue, but I don't really have a realistic or tractable project for what could fix that. Is there something that you think is tractable and fixable in philanthropy?
Yeah, I do. I see two kind of like real movements that could exist and come into the philanthropy world and make like quite a big difference and haven't really penetrated. And why I think of them in kind of movements or waves is because historically philanthropy has been very trend driven. They kind of get excited about a trend. They get excited about a given area or a given approach or whatever. Like right now, it's trust-based philanthropy. Everyone in philanthropy is talking about trust-based philanthropy. You got to trust the people. You got to give unrestricted grants. That's like the hot, cool thing. But not that many trends ago was the randomista trend. Let's use evidence. Let's use RCTs. Let's use studies. And people won Nobel Prizes. It got big. That was a really big thing. So when I think about how to improve philanthropy, I think about what is a trend that is close enough and viable enough that it could kind of go through the philanthropy world and could result in long-term people taking this into account. And there's two things that I think fit the bill. One is cost effectiveness, price tag, however you want to frame it, some sort of valuing of the cost per output that happens. I think there's something very valuable there. I think there's a 5-10% of philanthropists talking about it really seriously, another 20% of philanthropists kind of talking about it, and most not at all. And I think that evidence-based, for example, is much more thoroughly penetrated into the philanthropic world. So if we got cost effectiveness to where evidence-based is, I think that'd be huge and a massive contribution of the EA movement. The other one is the concept of charity evaluation. So public, externally evaluated charities by an unbiased actor who's just trying to find the best thing in the cause area. I think there's something very appealing to that. I think that movement gets stronger every additional charity evaluator we add because people can't just be like, oh, it's just GiveWell. Now they have to be like, well, it's just GiveWell and Animal Charity Evaluators and Giving Green and Happier Lives Institute. Okay, now there's actually quite a few charity evaluators out there, isn't there? So I'm all for there being like 10, 20 charity evaluators that are trying to maximize within a specific ethical framework or moral framework to try to come to the best things. And I think that could also become a valuable trend. I think there's some trends that are adjacent that are good too. Like there's a fund trend right now that I think is valuable. I like philanthropic funds. I think they solve some problems.
No, that makes sense. I'm also fully bought in on both the random Easter trend and unrestricted giving. I'm like, if you're funding an org, you generally should be funding the org and don't hassle them over much about like where exactly is my personal dollar going. So I'm sympathetic to both of those points. I do want to sort of ask when you're talking about charity evaluators, there were definitely pre-EA charity evaluators that are very focused on sort of governance and spending efficiency is defined by how much goes to admin, how much goes to sort of direct project work, however that gets defined. And it seems to me that you are saying, no, we want to move beyond that at least and say we are evaluating some sort of output or some sort of comparison point here, even if that is like, oh, it's comparison. So we are also running relatively close on time. Some people are going to start to dip soon, so I do want to ask an audience question. Are the slides that you have available anywhere? If you can send them to me or share a link, I think people would appreciate them. I certainly would be interested in being able to go over what you've said because it's been a lot of really good information. And I want to be able to follow up on it.
Yeah, definitely. I will.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Really appreciate that. So then, asking sort of another question, I'm curious what you think the limits of comparability are. So you talked about sort of health versus economic growth and economic outcomes for individuals, where that's something where it's difficult to evaluate at an org level, but for many individuals that's going to be more comparable. What else do you think is sort of a good line between org and individual comparisons? Should it be that, okay, should there be like different animal charity evaluators depending on whether one is more interested in charismatic megafauna or shrimp or founder animals, or should that all be like, no, we can run numbers and compare them in a way that's reasonably trustworthy? How do you cut that reality?
Yeah, I think how I'd think about it is how many distinctive output metrics are there, and then how much interested people are there in that outcome metric. So taking the animal case, the whole field of farmed animals isn't that big. So I'd be kind of surprised if there was room for like three different charity evaluators, even though, yeah, there are assumptions that ACE makes that one could argue with and say, oh, well, what if you tweak this or tweak that? I think the sector's probably small enough that one charity evaluator makes sense. On the other hand, say something like global health, that is a really big sector. I can imagine pretty small ethical tweaks leading to different things. So we talked about health versus income. Those are easily different charity evaluators. I can even see an argument for death versus disability being different charity evaluators because people value those quite differently, and they're pretty fundamental ethical things. I don't really think that there's like a true answer that one could figure out or come to on that sort of trade-off. So I can imagine that. The controversial one is should there be country level charity evaluators? So should there be like the best thing in India or the best thing in the Philippines or the best thing in America? And on the one hand, okay, well, say a ton of people are going to donate to America anyways, might be valuable to have the best thing in America. I do want that. On the other hand, what is the ethical judgment call there? The ethical judgment call is I really don't care about global people. Ooh, that one's a bit tougher. So I think when it comes to the more expanding circle type judgments, I'm a little less excited about charity evaluators that don't take that stuff into account, like don't try to look at a more global perspective. But as soon as it comes to an outcome trade-off, so health, wealth, education years, this sort of thing, that becomes a little bit more viable, I think, for me to have charity evaluators. So if I was kind of thinking about the top 10 charity evaluators, it'd be something like that. But appetite plays a really big role. So I talked to someone who was thinking about doing a charity evaluator for disasters. So, like, what happens when a humanitarian crisis happens? What's the best thing there? I think that makes a lot of sense because there probably are great things that happen there and probably pretty crappy things that happen there. And, maybe when an earthquake happens, it's not actually the best time to donate to earthquakes. But whether you like it or not, there's going to be a lot of money going to earthquakes. So, in some ways, the structure of a charity evaluator makes sense when there's enough data to differentiate and a lot of interest going towards that given area. That's kind of the distinguishing characteristics.
That makes sense. And I feel like there's could be fuzzy boundaries there where a lot of people say, okay, I want to donate to women in some fashion. And, like, okay, what is the best charity for women's health? Plausibly AMF, right?
Yeah.
That doesn't necessarily satisfy every donor, but I think even if you divide AMF by two, you're still beating a lot of its competitors. And so
Yep.
you can ask that question, and I'm sort of it seems like that's a fuzzy line, but I see where you're. I think I see where you're coming down on it.
Yep.
And we are sort of at time, so thank you very much. I really appreciate your time. I've certainly learned a lot from this talk. If I understand correctly, you will be doing office hours next in Gather Round, so if anyone wants to continue this or ask you more questions without having to accept me as an intermediary, then you're welcome to follow that. For everyone else, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for indulging me as your MC. Thank you for listening to Joey Savoie of AIM, and I hope you have a wonderful time and you've had a wonderful conference. Farewell.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye.